Good evening, everyone. My name is Ms. Sbaiti. I am the research analyst at the Center for International Regional Studies, and on behalf of the center, I would like to welcome you all to tonight's very important panel discussion titled Persisting Biases, which will be looking at the findings from the UNDP 2023 Gender Social Norms Indexes. I believe the report is available on UNDP website for download, so if you're interested in reading the report in detail, please go onto the website and download that. Before we go into the panel discussion, I would like to remind you about a couple of housekeeping points. Please turn off your mobile phones or put them on silence. We are recording tonight's talk, so if you're interested in listening to the discussion again, the video will be available on our website, which is cirs.georgetown.edu, and our YouTube channel, so please check it out in a couple of weeks' time. I will also encourage you all to, if you haven't already, please sign up on our mailing list. If you're interested to be subscribed, please talk to my colleague Maram, who will take your details and make sure you get all the information of our upcoming events. Talking about our upcoming events, I'm very excited to announce our upcoming forum, which is titled Global Energy Cultures, How Energy Shapes Our Everyday Lives. This will be held on December 9 and 10 at Musharraf Museums, and we have very exciting artist talks, and panel discussions, so please join us for that. Without further ado, I would now introduce the moderator for tonight's discussion, Dr. Biplove Choudhary. Dr. Choudhary is the UNDP technical representative and head of UNDP office in Doha, where he has been working since 2007. He has over 25 years of development policy and programming experience in Asia Pacific and African regions, including in complex crisis and fragile country context. He has been a senior advisor to governments and key stakeholders in over 14 countries in Asia and Africa, and has been widely acknowledged as a thought leader and a policy innovator. Published widely, Dr. Choudhary is an economist with a doctorate degree in international trade and investment, and has successfully completed the Cambridge Advanced program on rethinking development economics at the University of Cambridge. Dr. Choudhary will now introduce our panelists and talk about the report a bit more. Dr. Choudhary, the floor is yours.
Yeah, okay. I guess now I can be heard, yeah. Thank you very much for the very kind and generous introduction, and let me join you in welcoming everyone to this panel discussion this evening on Persisting Biases, findings from the UNDP 2023 Gender Social Norms Index report. Let me first of all thank Georgetown University and the Center for International and Regional Studies for partnering on this event and also generously hosting it. A big thank you to Zara for being so welcoming, and also to Maram and colleagues for facilitating this event. We are really grateful. You're hosting us again after the launch of the Human Development Report earlier, so we are particularly grateful. Pleased to welcome our colleagues joining from New York. We have, of course, Raquel Laguna, who is the Global Director of Gender Equality in UNDP. You have her on our screens. And Pedro Conceição, Director of the Human Development Report Office in UNDP. And also, of course, we have Professor Nadya Sbaiti, visiting assistant professor in the Department of History at Georgetown, so you all, of course, know her. This is the panel which will essentially be talking and unpacking the report for us. But before we get there, just to start the conversation, if I may, in September of 2023, we had the SDG Summit, as all of you will be aware. And what came out of the summit was very disheartening and disappointing, but perhaps not very unsurprising given all that is going around, including the various conflicts and the impact of COVID, that the progress at the half point, the midpoint of the SDGs has been very slow, off track, if I may say so, and fragile, with only 15% of the Sustainable Development Goals being seen as on track. And if you look at the SDG 5, which is the goal on gender equality, there are some estimates or forecasts which are saying that it'll take about 300 odd years for gender equality to be achieved completely, which is a very shocking figure. So obviously it's a wake-up call for everyone, and there's a call for action and redoubling of our commitment to accelerate progress on the SDGs. And this is the context for this particular report, particularly vis-a-vis SDG 5. The Gender and Social Norms Index report quantifies the biases against women, capturing people's attitude on women's role along 4 key dimensions: political, economic, educational, and physical integrity. The report covers 85% of the global population and reveals that close to 9 out of 10 men and women hold biases against women. We'll, of course, learn more about the report from Pedro and Raquel, and also from Professor Nadya in relation to the Middle East also specifically. And we'll also hear more about the fact that challenging these biased gender social norms is a choice we can all make today, and also some pointers on how we can drive change towards gender equality. So let me dive straight into the report and unpacking of the report. And if I may just turn to Pedro. Biased gender social norms, Dr. Pedro, as we are aware, are a major impediment to achieving gender equality and empowering all women and girls. This particular SDG, as we all know, has a multiplier effect across all areas of development. So the question to you is, why is it important to consider gender social norms in development, and also to highlight maybe the main results of the 2023 GSNI report? Over to you, Pedro.
Thank you so much, Biplove. Nice to be with you, Nadya, my colleague Raquel. Good evening, everyone. It's a great opportunity for us to have this dialogue and discussion. And you ask, why should we care about gender social norms, Biplove? And you mentioned also COVID-19. And I think what we went through during the COVID-19 pandemic puts in sharp relief why we should care about gender social norms. So if you look at a typical recession historically, recessions tend to be more impactful in a negative way on men than on women. That's the typical pattern of economic recessions. And yet during COVID-19 in many countries, we saw the exact opposite. We saw that women were much more affected than men. Why? The reason has to do, to a large extent, with the pervasiveness of gender social norms that are biased against women. So we saw 2 things during COVID-19. First, we saw that women were overrepresented in some of the economic sectors that were more affected by lockdowns. And the fact that they are overrepresented in these sectors means that society, the economy, already sorts occupationally between men and women, and sort of pushes women to certain occupations that in the case of COVID-19 were more affected than others, in which men are more represented. So this is one manifestation of how gender social norms had a bearing on the outcomes for women during COVID-19. And secondly, we also saw that expectations about the role of women, for instance, on care, asserted themselves very forcefully. So women were expected in many places, in most places actually, to fulfill what society expected of them when it came to responsibilities of care, for instance. So this is also a reflection of social norms. So we saw as a consequence a sharp decline in the labor force participation of women in many countries during COVID-19. So women withdrew from participating in the economy, in part as a response of the social expectations driven by biased social norms. So I think that it's important for us in development to recognize that gender equality outcomes are driven by formal institutions, by what the law expresses, and this is obviously very important, and there is still a long way to go. But also we need to pay attention to these informal institutions, to what plays in the background in the context of social norms, because ultimately these may be as important in determining outcomes for women as what's formally expressed in law. Maybe I'll pause here, Biplove, before I go into the findings of the report, if that's okay.
No, thank you, Pedro, for highlighting some of these very, very stark, evidences coming out of how these biases are actually playing out in our societies, in our economy. So, in terms of the overall report itself, would you be able to sort of highlight some of the key findings, particularly vis-a-vis the Arab states in general, but Qatar in particular?
Sure. So the most striking finding of the report was already mentioned by you. I think it's quite shocking to find that 90% of the global population harbors at least one bias against women. And I think it's important to understand how do we come to this conclusion? How do we find that these biases persist? And this is on the basis not of asking people whether they are biased against women. Most likely people would tend to answer no to a question like that. But we based our findings on answers to questions such as, who do you think makes a better political leader? A man or a woman? Or who do you think makes a better business executive, a man or a woman? And it's in answering these questions that we find this 90% figure of biases against gender equality. And another interesting fact is that they are almost the same across men and women. So this shows that these biases are very deeply entrenched in society. And shared almost equally by men and women. Another important finding of the report, and this goes back to your first question about why should we care about social norms, is that historically there has been a correlation between narrowing gaps in education, gender gaps in education, and the narrowing of gaps in the economic participation of both men and women. So there was a high correlation between the evolution of the two. So in other words, as we made progress in narrowing gaps in education, this was also reflected in broader economic empowerment of women. But that connection has been broken in recent years. Even though in many parts of the world, women, including in Qatar, by the way, women are more educated than men. We saw that link between improvements in education and improvements in the economic participation of women is broken. So this suggests that social norms are playing a role here in the background in sustaining these biases, at least when it comes to the economy, in not enabling progress on gender equality. The final interesting finding of the report, there are several others, but I'll just mention one more, was the impact that we found when it comes to having a woman as a leader of a country, either as head of government or head of state. And our results show that this can either advance progress towards reducing biases or actually exacerbate biases. Why? The reason is that when women get to positions of power, according to our analysis, there are two effects. One is positive in reducing biases, in that it reduces stereotypes, because it shows that women can rise to these positions of power. So this is a positive effect that dominated in countries in which we saw progress. But we also found, and this is widely supported by many studies, and it's a robust result in the literature, that when women get to positions of power, they are subject to more scrutiny than men. And this has a negative effect. So in some context, this negative effect had the predominant effect. In those cases, we saw deterioration of biases against gender equality. So there are many other things, but let me stop here, Biplove.
Thank you, Pedro, for highlighting some of these very important findings. What particularly I was struck by was also the fact that the gender and social norms are persisting over time. As shown by the values of GSNI, we have seen that they've stagnated over the past decade. And also what also struck me was that these biases are pronounced not simply in the lower income HDI countries, but also in the higher Human Development Index countries. And they hold across region, across income levels, across cultures. They're truly a global issue and pervasive. Let me with this turn to Raquel, if I may. Raquel, in your work on the gender social norms, why do you think these biases are so entrenched and so pervasive? Over to you, Raquel.
Thank you, Biplove, and thank you for inviting me also. And it's a pleasure to be here with the Center for International Studies of the Georgetown University, and with Pedro, and with you, Biplove, and the colleagues that I guess are behind, right? So, and there may be students and different people. So you are asking the $1 million question, or million whatever question, right? Why these norms and values are very entrenched in societies. And part of the reason is the process of socialization, how we grow up when we are building our identities when we are kids, right? And we are exposed to the different socialization actors, from family, school, to the religion, to the different institutions, as Pedro said, formal and informal institutions. So there is a window where human beings, we are like sponges, right? Sponges, and we absorb this perception, the value system that are not really tangible, right? It's not as easy as changing, I don't know, the wall of a house, or it's not about mathematics. It's about how our brain and how societies kind of come together, and how we go from our individual identities to the collective, and what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? So we receive a strong mandate on these expectations from societies on how to perform the different gender roles. And this is why, I apologize, I have a phone call. So this is why gender norms, values, beliefs, systems are challenging to change, because are part of our individual conscious and unconscious kind of identities, let's say that. So it is also embedded in institutions. So is a cosmos, kind of a complex cosmos to move and to change, I would say.
Thank you, Raquel, for shedding light on some of these, the sort of main structural reasons in terms of why they are so entrenched. The question then, of course, to all of us is, what role can UNDP play in this setting? Obviously, changing these norms and these biases, which have been so sticky and so persistent over time and across countries and regions. How do you sort of begin to address them? And can you give us some examples of how UNDP is supporting countries across regions, also in the Arab region here, to address some of these negative gender social norms? Over to you, Raquel.
So there are many ways of addressing this, right? And there is not one single kind of silver bullet. For UNDP, if we take into account our mandate, which is development with several pillars, right? In the broad meaning of development, we work on governance, we work to eradicate poverty, we work to make our planet safer, right? For people and planet. So I'll give you examples because to cover the whole spectrum is not easy. But for instance, when we work on governance, we have clarity that we need to invest in strengthening and equipping institutions so they do not reproduce the bias, the gender kind of bias and the norms that are going to naturally discriminate and exclude women in this case, right? Or girls. So we invest in them in public ministries, ministries of labor, ministries of economy. So we, for instance, are working now helping countries to ensure that fiscal policies, taxation systems are not biased. So this is just an example. When we talk about governance, we talk also about strengthening the grassroots movements that are also leading the change in the social norms also. So we invest in women's organizations, in community, at the community level. Another example is, for instance, when we work to eradicate and address and prevent violence against women, we just do not work only in the dimension of the policies. We also work on the changing perceptions, changing the narratives, the campaigns, communication campaigns, but also we work hard to put at the center safe spaces to discuss about masculinities, right? About what does it mean today to be a man in different societies? What does it mean to be a woman? So we use different methodologies. For instance, we also how we are not going to capitalize on the digital transition. So we work and we use the digital tools to, for instance, monitor these perceptions using Twitter, social media. So we get a clue and a flavor of how in different countries, societies are perceiving gender equality or different dimensions. The work of my colleagues of the Human Development Report Office is so fundamental, and this is also what UNDP does. We produce data, we generate analysis, so we put on the table in the global kind of conversation how gender norms and values are really stopping and are the main kind of stick in the wheel of the progress on gender equality. And last point, because I wanted to make it short, any work that we do helping countries to change their legislation or to have more programs expanding care systems are going automatically to help to change these perceptions. So it's complex, but there are many, many exciting things that we can do together, of course, with partners.
Thank you, Raquel, for walking us through some of these the key ways in which we can perhaps make a difference. Let me turn now to Professor Nadya, if I may. We've heard from Dr. Pedro and Raquel, Nadya. This report is it's a global assessment. It's painting it's a big picture with broad strokes and some conclusion that we have seen. I'd be very interested to hear from your perspective, an academic perspective and research perspective. You've been engaged on this topic for decades. So how might we think and understand this report, especially if we try to contextualize it specifically within the Middle East?
Can everyone hear me? Great. So first, I just want to take this moment to thank Zahra and CIRS and the UNDP for holding this collaborative event and for inviting me to participate. It's not often that an academic can speak to the quote-unquote real world about issues like this. So I have a lot to say. I hope you'll bear with me if I read some of the notes. So a couple of preliminary points, which is that I am a historian, and so as a historian of the Middle East, I'm always looking for historical foundations and processes, which leads me to ask not just the what, but the why. And so that was also how I approached this particular report. And also as we delve into historical reasonings and historical contexts, right, especially around a region like MENA, we realize that we cannot discuss the region as a monolithic whole, right? The Gulf looks very different than the Levant, which looks very different than North Africa, and even then we can further sort of, break up these subregions into individual parts, each of which has its own particular historical trajectories and networks and contexts and all of these things. And I take the time to discuss these distinctions because they matter in the way that we end up talking about some of the results here. So very quickly, what The report, as we've heard, I think suggests that in encouraging women's empowerment, right, it suggests that women's empowerment is predicated primarily on economic empowerment, largely through business, right, and other modes, and leadership in politics or in public administration, right, and that at some places it mentions that sort of care work or domestic chores are sort of implied to be sort of an impediment, right, to certain types of empowerment. So what I think this report reflects accurately, and even though we have to think about the Middle East and North Africa as sub-regions, there are, I think, some broad strokes, broad narrative arches that we can think about in terms of talking about this region as a whole. One of those things is it is generally reflecting, right, that the overall idea that women and girls should be empowered and that in doing so, we all benefit. I think this is something that is very, very difficult to argue with, and I think in general we see this across the region. We certainly see, right, and this country, Qatar, is an excellent example of this, right, the benefits of women being in politics, right, of being not just in politics, but visibly so. Not necessarily as heads of state, but sometimes the equivalent to it, right? And so the benefits of women in political and public office and the changes that they can offer, and also the role model that they provide, right, in ways that are deeply influential and often intangibly so on younger generations, but also on a society as a whole. And I think one of the key parts of this report that are really critical is the role of education. So educating women does, right, empower the society as a whole, but does empower women. And we also see, as was mentioned earlier, that even though education gender gaps are closing, those aren't necessarily being translated into narrowing wage gaps, right? So I'm just sort of excerpting a few points in the report that I think are very clearly reflected around the MENA region. At the same time, I think there are a couple of sort of core infrastructural foundational issues that are hinted at in the report, but I would like to pull out more clearly, and maybe we can have a discussion around them, that I think need to be considered, that I feel are main central axes that we can't ignore when we talk about this region. And the first is, in the discussion or in thinking about foundations and causes, right, which this report is interested in doing, we have to discuss the impact of war and invasion. We're also in this moment. It's just like we're in this moment of, what is being called, whatever you want to call it, genocide, onslaught, occupation, right? But to have this conversation, especially now, and not to discuss war, invasion, occupation, uprisings and revolution, right? Ethnic cleansing and genocide, these we know, right? In this region, but not just this region, in the last decade, it has been replete with multiple instances of this, right? And this absolutely has to be factored in, right? Raquel, you talked about the process of socialization, but I would argue that this is foundational to even that process of socialization, right? This has to be factored in as a leading cause of women's disempowerment, right? And a main reason for the crises, right, the term crises which this report uses, right, leads to particular detrimental social norms for women, right? As many feminist and gender scholars have noted, if you stand for the emancipation and empowerment of women and girls, professionally, educationally, financially, then armed conflict needs to be considered and advocated against, right? And pulled out as an explicit reason for how social norms are maintained, right? Armed violence creates a host of issues, right? Crises that lead to women getting the short end of the stick, which we see time and time again. And again, this is not exceptional to the Middle East, but it's something that the Middle East is primarily, quote unquote, known for, and so we have to talk about this. Women lose out on employment, on education, the age of marriage plummets, right? These situations create economic austerity, not just here, but also in countries, that we talk about as sort of the West, that tend to enhance male patriarchal roles, right, that often rely on diminishing women's voices. So that's the first thing. And the second thing that I would like to pull out is the question of where migrant workers fit into this report, right? are we thinking about, how is the report conceptualized sort of residents versus citizens in the questions, right, in the survey, I'm assuming surveys, and correct me if I'm wrong. I was trying to sort of understand how that worked in terms of the polling. But how to take into account migrant labor and migrant workers, and in particular female migrant workers, in ways that understand how they both reinforce existing social norms in the host countries, in the countries in which they labor, as well as challenge them, right? How does the existence of migrant labor shape these results that we get? And there are a lot of ways to think about this. What's the connection between migrant labor and racialization, and how does that racialization and then in turn affect how attitudes towards women and girls then, manifest, right? How does female migrant labor facilitate other women's gendered roles and the ability to say for other women in the sort of, host country, to put it one way, to then get an education, to then work outside the home, right? So I think what accounting for migrant labor also points to is the way in which there's an interdependent relationship that is at the heart of also the results that come out in this report, right? And of course, this interdependent relationship is at the heart of development studies in general, right? And the sort of whole field of development as a whole. So these are the 2 points that I really want to pull out, which is, how do we account for armed conflict in all the different ways that it sort of manifests? And the second is, how do we account for migrant labor when we take a look at these results, right? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nadya, for adding very valuable dimensions, particularly as far as the Middle East region is concerned, but I suspect also broadly to other parts of the world where armed conflict is happening and is actually now, it's been growing in an unprecedented way in different parts and it's surprising us with the sort of scale and intensity. You touched upon very important issues of how, some of these norms gender social norms are playing out vis-a-vis migrant workers and female migrant workers and so on. So with this, if I may, as an academic, how do you sort of engage with this report in terms of how women and girls and their experiences are being framed and conceptualized? It'll be very interesting to hear your perspectives on that, if I may.
No, thank you for that question. I mean, so I think there are, as a historian, as an academic, right, my field and my discipline, really push towards moving away from thinking that all women all over the world have the same experience, right? Or or understand agency in the same way, understand empowerment in the same way. Right? I mean, this report points to very important aspects for understanding and for being able to gauge women's empowerment, right? So again, economic empowerment, right? Politics, engaging in the political life, public political life, at the national level, right? And financial, right? Or being in the sort of business or corporate world, I think, as it puts in. But I don't think that those are the only places where we can account for women's empowerment and agency, right? Doing that occludes a whole set of conditions and circumstances where women and girls are extremely active, right? I think, Pedro, you mentioned very early on the discussion of sort of informal spaces and informal institutions, and I think that can be, highlighted further because so for example, I'll just sort of quote from the report, right? I think at some point, I agree, right? As the report says, by excluding women from social choices and decision makings, we lose out on perspectives, experiences, abilities, voices, and ideas, right? Making everyone worse off. I think this is 100, I personally agree with, and I think most people would. The statistic that 10% of heads of state are women, right? Leaves them at the margins of decision-making, I think narrows immensely the landscape with which women can be considered leaders. Being president or prime minister or being in a corporate boardroom are important, but they can't be the only or even the main bar by which we measure women's leadership, presence, and roles. by that standard, if we only stick to that standard, right, women have indeed made very low strides when their leadership may not even, in spaces where their leadership may not even be considered. So if I zoom out for a moment, I think what we are seeing, we seem to be living, and I rarely say this, but we seem to be living almost as a planet in a moment that has been here for a while, so it's not just this month or this year even, but we seem to be living in a moment of like rapid, disillusionment, I think, with politics as it appears on a national scale. And so much of the political progress, right, the choices that are made, questions around agency and decision-making, right, is happening not on the national scale, but on the communal one, or on the community level. And those are the spaces that academic studies and that other sorts of polls, right, show time and time again, right, are the spaces where women's leadership is consistently visible, right, where they make actually the biggest inroads. And so, I would be really interested in thinking about how to incorporate, and I realize that's far more work, that's far more sort of legwork that has to be done. But I would be really interested in thinking about, so if we incorporate those spaces into the consideration of of the evaluation engaging women's empowerment and women's emancipation, right, what the story would look like at that point. And in doing so, then we can also get at the more granular level, right, the different ways that women and girls understand agency and empowerment that might not look the same around the world, right? I mean, there are a couple of my students here, I teach a Women and Gender in the Middle East course. We taught this semester, and that's one of the things that we try to emphasize, or that I try to emphasize, which is, there isn't one experience of being a woman. I mean, I think most people would agree, right? And so I would be really interested in finding ways that account for that in reports like this. That's where I would stop for them.
Well, thank you, Professor Nadya. I think very, very interesting aspects. I particularly am struck by your point about, not simply looking at the metric of political leadership of the country, but looking at other spaces. In a way, you're already setting an agenda for research. And I was wondering, what kind of an afterlife do you think reports like this should have? Before I turn to, Pedro and Raquel for some reflections on some of your very rich contributions.
I would love this for a report like this. I would love for a report like this to really investigate those two axes that I mentioned, right? So think about the conditions that give rise to social norms. And absolutely the family, religion, right, issues around sort of society absolutely factor into that. But those are themselves shaped by war and conflict, revolution, genocide, occupation, right? They are proven time and time again to be detrimental. So again, I'll just repeat, and I'm not the first and only person to say this, right? I quote, the anthropologist Leila Abu-Lughod, and again, my students who are here will know what I'm about to say, but if we are interested in actually emancipating women, then war and conflict has to be the first sort of step towards in eliminating that, because it absolutely, right, hinders and cements, right, negative social norms, right, negative sort of biases, as the report puts it. So I would really appreciate if the report, has that kind of effect moving forward. I think the question that this raises, how do we avoid forcing a diversity of contexts and experiences into a linear notion of development? In considering women's diverse experiences and definitions of agency, right, as we think together about this, as you put it, this shocking number that it's going to take 300 years to see any change. But my sense is maybe we need to look elsewhere for indications of that change that we might not be actually seeing at the moment, but that are already there.
Well, thank you, Professor Nadya, once again for adding these very rich perspectives, and I think they're really giving us, new lenses to look at the report and also look at what else we should do to take some of these conversations forward in a concrete way. Maybe before we turn to the audiences who've been sort of patiently listening in for some questions, Pedro and Raquel, would you have some reflections on Professor Nadya's interventions on the report? If I could just turn over to Raquel first, and then maybe to Pedro for just some quick reactions and reflections on what you've heard from Professor Nadya before we open up the floor to the audience here. Over.
Thank you, Biplove. I think it has been super interesting to listen to you, Professor Nadya, and how I'm not going to agree and connect with what you are saying about how conflict and wars is infusing and impacting in the disempowerment of thousands of women and girls, and not only women and girls. I wanted to say also many men. So, and you will probably the last report of the Secretary General on the 1325 resolution, where he's putting on the table very clearly this report, the impact of militarism, concepts like toxic masculinities, this kind of big chain that is now spread and is intense and is painful and is deep. How definitely and I think all the community, at least for UNDP, we work on crisis countries, we respond to crisis countries, we work in the prevention of conflict. We have full clarity that in the prevention are the seeds of development, if you allow me to say that, and the seeds of equality and equity. So I cannot enforce more what you are putting on the table on that. And it's very well documented, the impact of war, the impact of crisis on women. When just mentioning one effect, like the rise of gender-based violence and sexual violence in conflicts against women and girls. So this is just one dimension. The other dimension is anytime there is a peace process, women are not seated at the table. So the plans for recovery and reconstruction are completely lacking the richness of the diversity of women. And this gives me the kind of a scenario to go to the second point that you made, that I also totally connect, that is very difficult to encapsulate the experience of being a woman in just one single category, even though at the same time, we need the statistics. So I hope Pedro will make the case for this kind of plain statistics that we need for advocacy, we need like a thermometer. But I think, and we try also to promote this different kind of understanding of leadership and power, right? We used to understand power in the formal sphere, like in the parliament. This is power. The CEOs of private sector, big companies, this is power, economic power. But there is a lot of power also in the networks of women at the community level, responding in conflicts to these safety networks. So I would like to say that in terms of development, we envision a world where power is more this kind of there is no one single meaning or answer to what does it mean power. So, and it's this kind of redistributed concept, a multi-layer concept, so this is the second point that I wanted to make, and you gave me in any case a lot of food for thought, and I wanted to, maybe we can give the room for Pedro, because your question about development, how we all know that development is not linear, at all. In fact, how can we add these kind of qualitative dimensions, and how this non-linear development can contain the diversity? So I will be very, very interested in Pedro's answer here. And whatever you wanted to say, Pedro, but I think it's a very interesting question. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Raquel. May I just turn to Pedro now? Would you have some reflections? In a way, Professor Nadya is setting a very interesting agenda for further research and how to sort of look at some of the findings vis-a-vis not simply this region, but beyond, in the context of war, migrant workers, female migrant workers, and so on. Over to you, Pedro, for any reflections before we open up for questions.
Thank you.
And answers.
Thank you, Biplove. I'll just try to restrict myself to 3 points, even though we could be discussing this for hours, I get a sense. So it's quite striking, the comments that Nadya made about contextualizing. These things, social norms, are deep-rooted and path-dependent, so obviously history here is crucial. I guess the challenge that we confront is how to square what could be described as universal aspirations, for instance, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with that diversity of cultural context and historical background that exists all around the world. So this is a question we've been grappling with, Nadya, I should tell you, and it's actually something that we're going to discuss to some extent in our forthcoming Human Development Report. And I should also tell you that we're engaging a lot with historians, which is unusual for a Human Development Report office. Traditionally, it's about development economists, and but more and more, and you'll have contributions from at least 2 historians on our forthcoming Human Development Report, because we recognize what you just said, that it's important to have this contextualization. So again, I leave it more as a question, not an answer. That's an ongoing process of how do we square these universal aspirations with the reality that is so culturally contingent, contextually diversified, and historically determined. How does one do that? So this is something that we are pursuing. And then, as Raquel said, and you as well, Nadya, it also connects to what we mean by development. And often when we present our report findings, for instance, to colleagues that come from indigenous peoples, they tell us, we don't care about the HDI. You think the Human Development Index is very important? That's not that important to us. We care about other things. So I think this is a very productive space of engagement and dialogue that we can pursue going forward. On migrants, from what I know from the literature, it appears that social norms are persistent. Sometimes they extend even to the 2nd generation. So there's always a debate as to how do migrants adjust when they move to a different society. Do they incorporate the norms of the society in which they are living, or do they persist in using or complying with the norms from the society from where they come from? And it appears that these social norms are persistent, at least when it comes to gender, sometimes extending even to the 2nd generation. So again, it speaks to the point about the persistence of gender social norms. And then on war and conflict, and then Raquel alluded to this, I mean, this is a very important agenda for the United Nations. We have a resolution of the Security Council, Raquel mentioned, 1325, that's all about this, women, peace and security. And I would, so you put the emphasis more on the negative impact, and Raquel also spoke to this, but I would emphasize also something that's very important in that resolution, which is the possibility of having women play a role in reducing conflict. I used to work in Africa for UNDP, and that was very clear that in conflicts in West Africa, in countries like Sierra Leone and Liberia, hadn't women been involved, we don't know what the outcome would have been. So also recognizing the role of women as agents that can enable peaceful outcomes is very important in my view. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, both Raquel and Pedro. And as you said, Pedro, this is a conversation which can and must go on and on. Hopefully, it's an enduring conversation, stimulating further thoughts and reflections. And you talked about the afterlife of the report. Hopefully, continue these conversations in your classroom settings as well, and for us also to reflect really in terms of how we can take some of these ideas forward in our future iterations. Pedro mentioned also about looking beyond HDI sort of metrics. These are very, very important aspects to look at. We are running a little bit behind time, if I may put that way. We have a very patient audience listening in. But if I may just open it up to colleagues to ask questions to our panelists.
Thank you.
If you can kindly introduce yourself and also mention who, if your question is directed to any particular panelist. Over.
My name is Kiran, and I'm an early stage gender studies researcher. It might be, I came in 8 minutes late, so if this has already been covered, apologies. It might be tangential and a little out of the scope, but it still has to do with gender. I've been a keen follower of UNDP's work and of all the UN bodies, particularly in the gender equality area for a really long time, since the original Millennium Development Goals were defined. And hats off. But as a gender studies student, not researcher, I'm still a little concerned that whenever there is the whole discourse about gender equity, gender equality, emancipation, et cetera, that not nomenclature, the terms, the lexicon is still based on the premise that all humanity is divided into two genders, without in any way underestimating or undermining the huge work that the UN bodies are doing, and I'm a great admirer, and I know that it has made a difference. But parallel to all that, is there also an effort to include other genders? Did that make sense?
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for your question. Maybe I'll just sort of collect a couple of more questions.
Thank you. My name is Deepak, and I specialize in international relations. So my question is more connected to the global south. So from an economic perspective, one of the main reasons why women's contribution are often hidden, and we are talking about women who are housewives or who are engaged in family businesses or who work in the farms. In case of housewives, this is unpaid, unvalued work which they often do without a break. Now, in India, for instance, certain states have introduced the concept of gender budgeting, which involves, some kind of basic income or monthly cash transfers to these women. So, is it something which you think is covered in the report or something which can be emulated elsewhere? Because even studies have shown that there is even an inverse relationship between gender budgeting and even domestic violence. Because women get more agency in those cases wherever the gender budgeting is strong. So just a question to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions or reflections or comments? Please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Hemar Thani, and I'm a senior at Georgetown University, and I'm a student of Professor Sbaiti's class. And I just have a few comments regarding, this report, because understanding, your point of, equality and equity, it also goes back to your point about the global south, and also goes back to your point about, including other genders. How is this going to be applied in areas such as the MENA region and with conflicting cultures, as well as I agree with Professor Sbaiti does not take into account conflict and war, because even men face these issues as well. Men with from the lower class, men who go through war and conflict have these gender biases as well. It's not just women, and other than men, there are also other genders within the spectrum that also face these issues. It's not just women as well. So I feel like, how is this report going to be applied in other perspectives? As this report also prioritizes taking into other perspectives as well. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. Looking around, if there are any more questions. So, I'm just conscious of time. We have to close sharp at 7. So maybe any one final thought before I turn it over to the panelists. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your very rich questions. Maybe we'll just go a quick round, beginning with you, Professor Nadya, if I may, and then turning to Raquel and Pedro.
Sure, I will keep this very short, and I don't think the first question was addressed to me, but I fully concur with you asking this question. I think that this absolutely has to be accounted for, not just because there are certain countries that have legalized a third gender, right, or a different kind of gender, but also because there is a whole spectrum of people who identify this way informally, right? And so the question, I think, and the challenge is, how do you gauge that in a report like this? How does one actually, how do you measure this quantitatively, right? So I agree, I think this is an excellent question. The question around unpaid labor, particularly housewives, is exactly right. I mean, this was in my notes, which I didn't quite get to, but absolutely, like when we prioritize or when we focus only on economic roles that in remunerated labor, then what happens, where does that leave an entire sector of women, right, who run households, who do unremunerated labor, right, in a family setting, in a particular, in other types of settings, where they exercise agency and choice and are empowered, but that is not measured, right? And so it's, again, an excellent question to raise, and part of what I was trying to sort of call for in thinking, in expanding the ways in which we think about even gender, right? Agency and choice, right? And then lastly, going back to Haim's question around men, absolutely, right? It needs to be accounted for. Part of why my own comments were around women and girls is because that seems to be the focus of this particular report. But certainly, and I will just use the example of what's happening in Gaza now and the ways in which, right, Palestinian men have been painted, a spectrum of from terrorist to monster to lascivious rapist, right? So absolutely, there needs to be a lot more work on addressing representations of men and particular kinds of masculinities in this region, but not just this region, and also in part of what I think can go towards changing some of the social norms, right, is actually educating men, right? So there's a lot of discussion about educating women, but there needs to be a conversation about educating men on a lot of these issues. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nadya. If I may turn to Raquel, did you have any quick reactions? We're almost out of time, just in a couple of minutes, if I may kindly request.
Quickly, very quickly, and I appreciate the questions because are genuine and honest questions, and that's what we like. So, of course, there is always a lot of room to do better on the identities, on the different gender identities, but UN and UNDP is committed and is doing work. For instance, we are now finalizing a guidance note to strengthening the participation of LGBTQI+ persons in electoral processes in different countries where the governments, and keep in mind that we respond to government, to the context, our work. In different countries, like in Pakistan, in Costa Rica, we have been definitely addressing different dimensions, the work on LGBTQI, scaling up their rights. In Latin America, we have a strong prioritization to integrate women trans in our programs on GBB. So my answer is yes, there is still a lot to do, but the UN and UNDP is already doing a lot on the different, integrating the different genders in our work, in our programs. But there is a point that I wanted to make, and it's a strong point. The fact that we work on women and the empowerment of women, it doesn't mean that we are automatically reproducing the binary dimension and the heteronormative kind of hegemonic approach. It means that we recognize there is one gender that is women in all the diversities that is systematically excluded. So there is a lot to do in terms of this kind of hegemonic paradigm. But on the other hand, it never should mean that we should stop working on the economic empowerment of women, on the political empowerment of women. It means that we need to do better and more on the other dimensions and the other identities. And I think we are for instance, in Costa Rica, we have been advancing the inclusion of LGBTQI in social services. So there is work that we have been pushing, or in Africa, where there is a criminalization, right? In some countries, we have been doing a lot of work there. So I don't want to get you the impression that we do not prioritize this, because we do it. And we have a team committed and doing good work in country offices. So I think that's the question I wanted to answer. I would love that Pedro also shares. In the last Human Development Report, I remember, Pedro, one full chapter, a full analysis is on how important it is to address the monolithic kind of understanding of gender identities. So back to you.
Shall I, Biplove?
Yes, please. Yes, please come in.
Oh, okay.
Pedro.
Thank you. Well, I think I need to be very brief, but I fully agree, not only myself personally, but that's core to the human development approach, with the idea that each of us is composed of multiple identities that overlap and have different salience at different spaces. So anything that's about putting people in boxes is a violence against this idea. So the fact that one highlights that there are these inequalities between men and women is not meant to exclude the recognition that there are other identities and other processes of exclusion that also matter. So I wouldn't put one against the other. Both merit consideration. And moreover, what we see, what the evidence clearly shows, is forces, arguments, narratives, positions that are against equality between men and women are also often against broader inclusions of other identities, including gender identities. So I think that rather than putting the two as oppositional, I think they can actually reinforce each other. That's the kind of approach that we take. And I should also mention that, of course, we can do more about recognizing the economic contribution of women in unpaid work and care. But I think the fundamental point that we need to question goes back to asking whether they are really effectively exercising agency. I mean, if we have these dramatic differences in the way in which men and women fulfill different roles in society, I think that bears the question on whether how these choices are being shaped. And again, the context of how social norms, which in turn are determined by culture, by history, shape those choices. And it goes back to the point I made earlier, whether we should have these broad principles of universal declaration of human rights, of equality, of inclusion, that should shape and guide our perspective on these asymmetries. So I need to say that I really enjoyed this conversation. I don't think we had enough time, but it left us with an appetite to continue the conversation in the future, Biplove. If you would be so kind to make sure that it happens, we'll be very keen, at least from the Human Development Report Office. And I want to thank Raquel and Nadya and all the colleagues participating in person for a very stimulating discussion that left us with many ideas on the way forward. Thank you.
Indeed.
And I joined Pedro.
Yes, please go ahead, Raquel, for your
So I just joined Pedro. It has been a pleasure. I am very curious with many other questions that colleagues, people may have, but maybe in a second round. And I really enjoyed a lot the intervention of Professor Nadya and the facilitation, your facilitation, Biplove. We need to have more of these conversations. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much to both of you for that kind offer. Professor Nadya is here. Of course, we'll be happy to make those connections in the future for continuing some of these discussions. As Pedro said, we are at 1 hour is certainly not enough, and we are already over time, so I'm sorry about the delay. and keeping you all waiting, but lots of rich data analysis and perspectives packed into this hour. Hopefully, lots of food for thought to stimulate further conversations. Let me just end by simply thanking to all our panelists, Professor Nadya, Raquel, and Dr. Pedro, and all of you for coming and patiently listening and for your rich contributions. And above all, to thank really CIRS and Georgetown and the wonderful colleagues, Zara and team. Thank you for organizing this and making this happen. Happy to continue the discussion in the future. Thank you.